Qatar is the podcast taking you behind the scenes with all 32 teams at the World Cup. We're hearing from the players, the fans and people in Qatar, telling the truly global story of the competition. That's World Football in Qatar from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
I'm Makikos, a journalist based in Tokyo, Japan. When I was a young woman in my 20s, I was admitted to a mental asylum. It was terrifying. In this program, I'm meeting others who have been through similar experiences. I've heard stories of people being tied to beds for days and weeks, lengthy sessions in solitary confinement, over medication, and one man who was held in a mental health hospital for more than 40 years. This is Asylums of Japan, Makikos' story on the BBC World Service. In early 2000, I had a breakdown after being involved in a difficult relationship. I was admitted to asylum where I was diagnosed as schizophrenic within the first minutes of being there. I was given a cocktail of drugs and put in a solitary confinement. It was exactly like a prison shell and everything was watched. It was also like a watch house. The building was so old and grey with no windows. I did not remember seeing any natural light at all. It was like a punishment being ill, and my body and my mind became completely paralyzed after overdose medication and so much solitary confinement. I was shamed. The whole experience left me terrified, and only recently have I been able to make sense of what happened to me. When I eventually managed to leave the asylum, we never really talk about it again. You see, mental health is a taboo for many in Japan, and historically, families are ashamed to have a relative with psychiatric condition. I reviewed my life and became a journalist. I now live and work in Tokyo, but I never stopped wanting to know about people who've been through the system like me. So for this program, I set off on a journey to find out more about Japan's mental health system and its history.
Passengers on this flight, please.
A good place to start, I thought, would be an area with an abundance of asylums. So I set off on a flight to the island of Okinawa, which is 1,500 kilometers from Tokyo and situated off the southwest corner of Kyushu in the East China Sea.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready for landing. Please make sure that
There are 1,000 asylums across Japan and more than 30 in Okinawa. That's a huge number, given Okinawa is only 1% of Japan's landmass. I knew this trip would bring back bad memories of what I went through, but I wanted to do it anyway. Someone has to start the conversation. We are not told much as a society about how people with mental health issues have been treated down the decades. So on arriving in Okinawa, I wanted to get a sense of the history and maybe begin to get understanding of why Japanese people still see mental health as a stigma. Together with Mr. Keigo Yamada from the Okinawa Mental Health Welfare Foundation, I traveled to the northern part of Okinawa to see an in-house surveillance barn called Shitaku Kanshi that was used until 50 years ago. Mr. Yamada explained the history.
In 1900, the Mental Disability Nursing Protection Law was established in Japan. This meant that the mentally ill were to be confined to their homes. It's something called Shajiki jail. If the house is small, you're meant to build a hut on the premises or on the outskirts of the village instead. These were blocks, wooden huts, The situation was so terrible that the law itself was actually abolished in Japan in 1950. However, home confinement continued under the United States rule for Okinawa until 1972.
It was a long journey into the forest, 3-hour drive, hidden in a bush, frightening sounds of cicadas. When we got there, Yoshikazu Hara, a filmmaker who spent his time highlighting these surveillance burns, took us on a tour of the building.
A man named Tomi Toshi was caged in this barn. Tomi Toshi was born and grew up with 8 of the family members. Over there you see their house. In his later teenage years he began suffering from a mental disease and caused some suspicious behaviour. His relatives got together and discussed what to do with him. They agreed to put him in an in-house surveillance barn. That is all in the documents.
The barn Yoshikazu Hara is showing is just 3 meters in length, 2 meters in height, and 1.5 in width meter. Very, very small barn. And inside, I see no light. All cemented wall with only a A4 paper-sized small window. And I see one bathroom, no sanitary, where his bed is lying.
Under the guise of maintaining public order and in the name of protecting the safety of the community, mentally ill people were locked in these shacks. By preserving this hut, we hope that outsiders will get a good understanding of the power that was wielded over mentally challenged people and others.
It's awful to think that people are held in that way, but given my short experience of solitary confinement in the early 2000s, it doesn't feel that surprising that we treated people like this in the not too distant past. Kurihara, who runs a group for parents of people who are reclusive, remembers isolation unit being used in people's homes.
From the back of my friend's house, when I remember hearing someone yelling, "Wan, Wan, Wan," my friend looked so embarrassed and I was too scared to ask him what was happening. I later heard that his older brother had gone insane and had been put in a throne room in the back of the house and was screaming. He was in a Sashiki jail. There are a lot of Sashiki jails in Okinawa. In the back room, I later found out they'd built iron bars in a 4.5 meter room and placed mentally ill patients in a kind of prison.
We will hear more from Kurihara later. I was very keen to speak to people who had experienced Japan's mental health system directly, whether they be patients or staff willing to talk to me. Someone who had researched treatment in Japanese asylums extensively is Toshio Hasegawa, a professor of psychiatry at Kyorin University.
There are 1.2 million beds in Japan, 300,000 used by mental illness patients. In fact, 260,000 at the moment. According to figures, 40% of beds in the 38 OECD countries are Japanese beds.
In Okinawa, I met Mika. She's been both a patient and nursing assistant. At one point, when she was hospitalized, Mika was put in a solitary confinement.
It was like a watch house, or really a prison-like place. They put me in an all-glass room and I was alone. There was a small hole or window with iron bars like a jail room, so I could be seen by everyone from the outside. All patients could see me. The bathroom was also in full view. There was no cover. The nurses could see everything.
Mika is not her real name. because she feared reprisals for speaking out. But when she was working in the sector, she saw several things that left her feeling very uncomfortable.
There were several people in the hospital where I worked who had been there for 20 years, and some other people had been in isolation for their entire time at a hospital. There was an old woman aged over 100 years old. It depended on the person, but those patients who were violent were physically restrained and prevented from standing up by staff. They were not allowed to leave their rooms. It may be so common and not unusual, but all the doors of patients' rooms were locked one by one from the outside. I, as a staff member, was given keys. Patients could not leave their rooms either. The nurses adjust the mental conditions of patients by feeding them the pills and insist this patient is calm now. But this is really for the benefit of the facility management and staff, not the patients. There are a small number of nurses looking after many patients at the same time.
At Michi Naoko, she worked as a caseworker in mental health for several years. She visited over a dozen asylums and witnessed some shocking things.
There were screams of patients. I was talking to a female patient. She had been admitted for schizophrenia. Suddenly, she started making strange noises. I thought they would calm her down by saying, "It's okay." They suddenly gave her an injection of medicine. When they injected her, the woman suddenly flopped over. I looked at it and thought, is this really okay, I thought. Even though she was not out of control. Japan has a really weak awareness of human rights for people with mental illnesses. They are locked up in dark rooms that are more like prisons. I think that if we could make the places brighter and more open, with sunlight shining in, and if we could warmly watch over them, more people would recover.
Naoko says she believes patients are often over-medicated and claims there is a culture of bullying of patients by some staff.
I guess the case where they get out of control and can't do anything about it is right for solitary confinement, but I worry it can also be used in a punitive sense. Psychiatric nurses work very hard, but they can be quite overbearing. I have witnessed many cases where they treat patients in a coercive manner. The nurses were very commanding to the patients. For example, "Do it quickly. Do it quickly." I think some of the nurses looked down upon the patients.
Not all hospitals have facilities to cope with people who are both physically disabled and mentally unwell. Reiko uses a wheelchair.
My mind and body are out of balance. I have an environmental adjustment disorder, which means that when I'm under a lot of stress, I push myself too hard. I wonder if I'm manic depressive. At first, I was in the hospital for about 6 months. But I had to go home every day to bathe, use the bathroom, and go back to the hospital to sleep again because I'm in a wheelchair. The psychiatric hospital didn't have handrails or anything like that. For a severely disabled person, a psychiatric hospital is not a place to be.
To get an idea of the true extent of the stories I've been hearing, especially around physical restraint and solitary confinement, I met Professor Toshio Hasegawa, who has been researching the situation extensively at Kyorin University.
Lots of people are being restrained. People with schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, all sorts of conditions. It's not just dangerous people. You see the lines, you see the dots. That's the trend for restraint and for confinement. Both, you can see, are rising dramatically. The ministry changed the way they counted recently, but the latest figures are 12,600 ordered to solitary confinement and 11,000 physically restrained as of last June. There is also chemical restraint, another huge problem. Japan injects a lot of people.
Oh my God!
The belt is used like this. It is wrapped around a bed.
Professor Hasegawa demonstrated me how people are physically restrained.
患者さんを仰向けに寝かせます。
First of all, a nurse has to make a patient sleep on their back. Then they wrap a thick part of the belt around the body. Next, since there is a hole here in the middle of the belt, a nurse will lock it with an iron stick, like magnet style. Once it fits inside the belt with a click sound, the belt will never be released from the body of the patient.
それでこの
The longer part of the belt is submerged under the bed. Then the body cannot come away from the bed. This is for the upper part of the body, and normally both arms and legs are tied up together as well.
それと両手と両足をやるのが普通です。僕が2015年に
A few years ago, I investigated 11 mental hospitals across all of Japan. On average, people were spending 96 days per patient being physically restrained.
Physical restraint. トイレはどうしてるんですか？お風呂とか。
ああ、はいはいはい。
They are not allowed to use the toilet. They cannot enter a toilet room. They have to use a diaper or nappy, or a catheter, a tube.
Professor Hasegawa says the long-term impact on the mental health of patients by over-restraint and solitary confinement cannot be underestimated.
まず身体拘束
When you are bound for so long, all your functions suffer. You can't breathe properly or eat well and digest, and your organs decline. People get deep bone thrombosis, and then there's the psychological trauma, which you have for life. It affects people of all ages. There was a 14-year-old girl who was once put in an asylum for an eating disorder.
障害 eating disorder で入院して
She sued the hospital after she was restrained for 77 days.
And over-restraint has cost lives. A voluntary visit to hospital in 2016 proved to be 40-year-old Kazuya Ohata's last. 8 days after being admitted, he was tied to his bed. 6 days later, after being released from the restraint, he died. Meanwhile, an English teacher from New Zealand suffering from bipolar disorder died after being tied to a bed in a psychiatric ward in Tokyo for 10 days. There is one story of incarceration in these institutions which has shocked people across Japan.
こんにちは、すいません。ピンポン鳴らないんですね。なんなんですよ。よろしくお願いします。
Tokyo Ito is currently taking the authorities to court after being held for 45 years. I went to meet him at his flat in Ota City in the Gunma Prefecture.
I was in the hospital from the age of 16 until I was 61. I was in there for most of the time, about 45 years.
His father took him to a mental hospital in Tokyo after he developed symptoms of paranoia. He was eventually held in a hospital in Fukushima Prefecture.
There were people who had been in the hospital longer than I had. As far as I know, there were 5 or 6 patients who'd been there for 30 years. I was living like a caged bird in the hospital. It was so frustrating. I wanted to go where I wanted on my own. I had wanderlust. I became more lonely. I was not allowed to go to my father's funeral. My stepmother wouldn't allow it. It's terrible.
He got better, but his requests to leave were always refused.
One nurse told me that I would be physically restrained and my body would be tied up into a bed. They made me sleep in a bed in a separate building, and the nurse said, "We can't let you go to the bathroom." They physically tied my hands and feet and made me wear a diaper, even though I was not in a bad state of mind at the time. It was terrible. They didn't treat me like a human being. I heard stories of nurses abusing patients. I heard stories of them dragging old patients around and abusing them. They abused old women. Some of the old ones wouldn't listen to them, so they dragged them around. It's chastisement, that's what it was.
It was only the Great Japan tsunami and earthquake in 2011 in Fukushima which created a chance for Tokyo Itao to leave. He was offered accommodation in a group home, and finally he was able to gradually leave the system. He says he really didn't want to die in a hospital.
I receive letters from strangers to me now. This is one of the letters I've had. Nice to meet you. My name is Kokoje. On September the 1st, I read your article in the Tokyo Shimbun. I myself suffer from schizophrenia for more than 6 years and I'm still in a hospital. I live apart from my 2 children, divorced 7 years ago. No support from parents or siblings.
お父さん宛てに知ってる人ですか？
じゃあ一言歌うか
1分でいいです。
俺の名前で
Tokyo always liked art and since leaving the asylum, he now spends his time painting cats. He also gets funds from karaoke.
俺の青春ソフ
綺麗な声ですね。Mental health is a serious issue for Japanese society, and hikikomori, meaning acute social withdrawal, affects over 1 million people.
First of all, my son refused to go to school. He just stayed inside. He became a recluse. He then became a germaphobe, taking baths 3 or 4 times a day.
Kurihara runs a worksite facility for people with mental health condition in the north of Okinawa.
In my case, I thought my son would be worse off if I forced him to be hospitalised. When Mother Teresa came to Japan, she asked Japanese people, "What is the opposite of love?" Mother Teresa replied, "The opposite of love is indifference." The culture of shame is unique in Japan, especially in Okinawa. We share our shame in our family group, but we don't want the outside world to know. If society took an interest, would patients be in isolation wards?
There is a worry that as young people get older and relatives die, many may end up in institutions. Sachiko is 70. Her son Taka, who has a mental illness, is 43.
I live on my pension, my son's disability pension, my salary, and my father's survivor's pension. I am worried about my son. Imagine what will happen after I pass away. I wish my son would get a wife.
I've heard some very alarming stories about mental health in Japan, particularly around over-restraint, solitary confinement, and the long periods people stay in hospital. So what do the authorities have to say about these issues? I put several points to the head of the powerful Japanese Psychiatry Association. Manabu Yamazaki.
As I've said many times, the large number of beds in those mental hospitals, the figures that are given are misleading.
Statistics suggest Japan has a large portion of the world's psychiatric beds, but Yamazaki says Japan's definition of a psychiatric bed is broader than in other countries, and so the figures do not make sense.
There is an administrative procedure in Japan that the police will put mentally ill people in a mental hospital, not send them to jail. In other countries, they go to prison. What would happen if we said we will not receive such patients? They'd be killed.
Manabu Yamazaki believes physical restraint is being appropriately applied in most cases.
As for physical restraints and isolation, Japan has a law called the Mental Welfare Law, which stipulates that isolation should be done in this way and restraints should be done in this way. It is decided by the law. The law says you have to examine the patient and you have to write the patient's medical record according to the law. That procedure is a huge hassle. The procedure is a lot of work. That is why, as a physician, I don't really want to do it. So I want to reduce isolation and restraints, but as a result, the Ministry of Health and Labour and Welfare says restraints have increased over the past 5 to 10 years. It's all misleading.
For their part, the Japanese government have been listening to the researcher like Professor Hasegawa, who recently got the chance to address the Diet, Japan's parliament. Psychiatrist Dr. Kanna Sugiura.
For a very short time, they had a kind of policy that says we would minimize involuntary admission. And that was what policy was written by the government. I was very happy to see that. About half of the admission in Japan is involuntary admission. So there are so many who did not choose to come to hospital but was in a hospital and they could not leave hospital. And it was quite shocking to me.
Now Japanese government wants to enhance community care for mental health. I think this is right.
Tsuyoshi Akiyama is a psychiatrist in Japan and president-elect of the World Federation of Mental Health.
This is right direction. It will help the patients to get to leave psychiatric hospitals and to live in a community safely, but it is still taking time.
20 years after my own experience in asylum, I'm finally able to process what happened to me. I hope more people will soon feel able to open up about their experiences and realize they are not alone. You've been listening to Asylums of Japan, Makiko's story with me, Makiko Segawa. It was a made in Manchester production for the BBC World Service.
The documentary is just one of our BBC World Service podcasts. There are many others to choose from.
The BBC World Service has a world of podcasts just waiting to be discovered. Hi, I'm Namulanta, and Season 1 of my award-winning podcast, Dear Daughter, is available in full now. It's a handbook to life, written for daughters everywhere.
My darling daughter, you're so much more than the color of your skin, the features of your face and body, the social class you come from, and who you marry. Those do not define you.
For Tales of the Unexpected, the Lives Less Ordinary podcast lays bare remarkable personal stories from around the world.
I had this secret.
And I just felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up.
I started having a strength in me.
Or to explore the stories behind the medals, the On the Podium podcast has some of the world's top athletes sharing their journeys to success.
How can I use this pain and this energy?
I think that breaking down stereotypes is so important.
That is a significant moment when you first win a medal at Olympic Games.
Whatever you're looking for in a podcast, the BBC World Service has something for you.
And it all gels together beautifully.
We're ready to go. We're ready to have fun. We're ready to party.
You can catch up with Dear Daughter, Lives Less Ordinary, and On the Podium now by searching for them wherever you get your BBC podcasts.